Okay, all right, I think we'll get started. So, good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the third of our breakfast meetings, our Rising breakfast meetings, and the first of 2021. Today, as you're aware, the focus is on soils and soil management. So, we're really, really, really proud to have George Sly talking about soil management, strip till and no-till. Many of you will know George. George is one of the sort of pioneers of innovation in Lincolnshire agriculture, and we're really, really privileged for George to spend this morning with us just to give him an update of what's going on at Horizon Agriculture, which is quite a lot. So I think it's going to be very interesting, and it really is laying the foundations for part of this transformation of agriculture that we keep talking about. But new cultivation techniques, large-scale agriculture, carbon sequestration, all those things that are absolutely front and point centre, highly topical at the moment. And then followed up with Ian, who I think most of you will know, who's in our own team. Ian's one of the few soil scientists in the country, and we're very privileged to have Ian. Ian's been working on a number of very, very applied soil science challenges around Lincolnshire, so he's going to give us an update on what's going on with his research. So hopefully a fantastic morning, and I hope it keeps everybody interested through the morning. Before I hand over to George, just want to give you an update of what's going on at Rhizome. So given the lockdown, I've literally, I think I spent 4 days out of the office since March 2020, but all I can say is we're really pleased to say is that there's an awful lot going on at Rhizome still, so we haven't really stopped. And at our first 2021 breakfast meeting, we'll be back in the hall, no doubt, once the pandemic's abated. I'm pleased to say that the hall's now pretty much completely renovated. We're ready to go back in. It's a new state-of-the-art agricultural innovation setting, which is new labs, new computers, new office space for all the staff. And the really good news for everybody is the university's also funded a new roof. So we've got an office now for the next 50 years or so, hopefully, to keep going, which is brilliant. And then lots and lots of innovation going on at Rhizome. We're now fully staffed. I think for anybody who's not aware, we've got a Lincoln Agri Robotics grant, £6 million Research England. That's employed 30 staff. Those people now in place, fully recruited. We've got an absolutely blitzing team now who are assembled. And that includes a pipeline now with 65 PhD students with the CDT, Centre for Doctoral Training at Cambridge and UEA, over the next 8 years. So really is world scale. So we're very, very proud of it, and we're just getting into gear. I think we're in second gear at the moment, about to move into third. So that's but really, really proud of that, and it's going well. And then in March we take delivery of our 5G testbed, so it'll be the first private 5G testbed for agriculture research. That'll be operational in March. So lots of innovations going on. And then just as a really quick update, the Eagle Lab with Barclays, that is now open, subject to lockdown, of course, but it's ready to go. We've converted the library at Rhizome into an Eagle Lab, which is a brilliant innovation centre for startup companies. And we're really proud to say that we've got our first tenant, and that's Terravesta, who may be on the call, which is a pretty well-known, famous, again, Lincolnshire company focusing on miscanthus production biomass. So it's absolutely point and centre for future agriculture in this sort of conversion of agriculture to new economies, so bioenergy and those sorts of things. So Terravesta is the first tenant. Lisa Bagley, I think, is on the call from Eagle Labs. So hi to Lisa. And Eagle Labs are launching an accelerator scheme with the university through this spring. So if anybody's young, keen, innovative, wants to start up an agri-tech opportunity and really wants to understand how to accelerate businesses through to something significant, please speak to Lisa, and we can help you put you onto that scheme. So we're really very proud of that. So that's my shout out for Rhizome. You'll be really pleased to know I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to hand over to George. And George is going to give us an overview of what's going on at Horizon Agriculture, soil management, strip till, and no till. So I've had a preview. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Simon. So I'd like to introduce myself. So I'm speaking half as a farmer and half as a director of an equipment manufacturing company, both based in near Holbeach in Lincolnshire. So I'm just going to run through some things that we're trying on our farm and linking to technology that we're developing at Horizon, and show you how that's been going over the last 2 or 3 years. So our farm is 5 or 6 miles south of Holbeach. It's around 300 hectares. It's mainly grade 2, and we're pretty much a ring-fenced block of land. It was previously contract farmed, and our side of the family has farmed it for the last 3 years. Most of the drainage system on the farm is coming on for 50 years old, so it's relatively tired but sort of functional, and we are plus or minus half a metre, in some cases plus or minus a metre from sea level. It's predominantly the farm historically was summer grazing. That's actually an error on the text there, but it was summer grazing up until the Second World War. Some of it was in our family then. And one of the first things we did when we took back the farm was to check the various metrics on the soil to see where we started as a baseline. So we had quite a heavy blackgrass problem. It's 40 to 50% clay in general, so it's heavy. It's a heavy clay silt soil, which has its challenges, especially in the last 3 years climate that we've had, in infiltration rates, etc. What was really interesting when we had various different organic matter tests done across the farm, was for me to present that in a kind of a hidden way to my father and say, at what point was this land put into annual arable production from a perennial pasture? And it's near 100% correlated with when it was converted to annual arable from grass and the organic matter levels on the farm. So as you'll see on the left-hand side, the fields up here, which are sort of in the 6s and 7s, they were in pasture until the mid-80s, whereas the lower end of the farm, or the southern end of the farm, was cropped from 1943, I believe. So on average, we have a benchmark, of a grass paddock which has never been annually cropped, and that's between 8 and 10% organic matter. So we've lost around half, between 50 to 60% of the organic matter on the farm over quite a long period, but nevertheless, it is going down. And on a structural soil structure basis, is also very tired in that way because of all that we've done to it. And that's proved particularly challenging in the past 2 years, where extreme rain events, sort of 40 mil plus in one event, the infiltration rates in the structure is not capable of handling that. And so it doesn't really matter what drainage system you have, you need the porosity and the structure which organic matter helps to give in the soil for us to be able to actually farm it profitably. So organic matter is a metric at which we look at quite regularly. We don't expect it to change quickly, because it doesn't change, hugely quickly. It depends what you do as to how quickly you can change it. But to me, I value it as one of our most the most valuable asset on the farm is how can we improve the carbon levels in the soil. Linking back to Horizon, so we work very closely with an American company on in-furrow soil sensors. So although the previous map I showed was was done by loss on ignition and another test, we also have optical sensors on both our seed drills and our precision planters, where every time we do a job in the field, whether it be drill a cover crop or drill a cash crop or drill a catch crop, we are scanning the top 50 millimeters at the moment of soil, and that is producing a map up into the cloud of a organic matter trend in the field. The actual value of which the sensors give at the moment isn't hugely accurate, but the trend across the field is very accurate, and that's what we're interested in, is looking at the long-term trend. So the sensors that we run, they're looking at soil moisture, organic matter, CEC, temperature, and they can also pick up residue if it's in your seed furrow, or it's going to contact the seed and change the germination of the seed. So all this data, we're trying to correlate that data into, of course, profitability, and to change our decisions of what we do on the farm. And the regular repeatable data that we're getting gives us information to say, is cover cropping working? Is this certain tillage practice working? Are we improving our soils, or are we degrading them? The sensors are also, as well as organic matter, with the organic matter data, they can also make decisions on the control system of seeding or planting machines. So this map shows a field of varying organic matter. This is actually in the US, and the planter is varying seed rate based on its live conditions. So it's looking in the field and looking at the conditions and making an informed decision, which is operating 10 times a second. And it can vary seed population, and it can also vary seed depth according to moisture and temperature to hunt for the perfect germination environment. And if you get even more complicated, it can switch seed varieties or seed hybrids based on droughty parts of the field, or wetter parts of the field, or heavier or lighter parts of the field. The control of different seed varieties is something we haven't yet tested in Europe, but the Americans are quite a long way on with that. If they have sand running into clay, or black running into clay or sand, they can select different genetics that perform better in different parts of the field to give the same maturity. And this technology is moving really, really quickly. So one of the most interesting things I've been looking at and trying to link with Horizon to give us a service through using our machines, not just by buying the actual asset, but by using the technology on it to actually reap a reward from the farm, has been, can we use some of this data and technology to secure carbon payments from carbon emitters? And we've just started a pilot scheme with a Danish company and a Danish university on our own farm, which is literally beginning now. And the initial income that we're going to see is somewhere between 80 and 120 pounds a hectare at the moment. There is great scope for that to grow and probably to double by 2025. And that's a significant income to us when you consider that the farm subsidy is likely to be largely removed. And we don't really have to do anything different than we do now. So we have to keep the soil covered as much as possible. We have to do as little tillage as possible. We have to use as little synthetic nitrogen as possible. But of course, we all want to maintain yield. So it's finding that balance of where does the carbon payment versus the yield and the soil health, where do those metrics align to give the best profitability on the farm? And that's what we're trying to study. So the carbon process, or the carbon payment process, there is obviously lots of emitters of CO2 in the world, and it's very soon coming in EU regulation as to more and more stringent rules on emitters and how much they'll have to pay a ton of carbon. And all of those emitters are looking somewhere to offset that. Obviously, one of the ways they will look is to stop emitting it and become more efficient, which is very important. They also look to offset it in forests or farms. And one of the missing links that's been there has been how to certify that a ton of carbon sequestered in a South Lincolnshire farm, how does industry know that that's real and that's stored and that's quantified? And the sensory data, satellite imagery, and physical tests and annual audits, all that linked together is producing a certificate which is ISO approved within the carbon trading industry. So if we do certain things on our farm and they do a test and our sensors are showing the right information, we might acquire 5 or 6 credits per hectare for a particular year, of which then we can trade them online through a platform. We can sell them back to the Danish company, or we can sell them to other individuals if we like. And that price of carbon trades just like your ton of wheat you're growing. So it's a very similar process. You can sell it to different brokers. And the price goes up and down. At the moment, it's a long-term trend. It's only going one way, which is up. So it's a really interesting income for farms, which the nice thing about it is you really can't do bad. You're only doing good to your soil and you're getting paid for it. So it's a really interesting system that we're working hard on. Another thing more of an idea of mine is that food labeling one day, if we obviously of course are used to seeing fats and saturated fat, sugars and salt, and if loads of those are red, then people know it's bad or it's good or whatever. But if you could look at how much energy went into the food and how much carbon was in the process of getting it to your house, what was involved, it would also help the efficiency of the industry, help with the carbon payment system, and there's various different there's various different companies in Denmark that are already working on this, and I know there's some work in Germany being done to create a labeling system like this. And all of this forms part of a very valuable asset on farm, which we don't really realize we have yet. So moving on from carbon, one of the things we sit in is we obviously make no-till drills, so direct drills for mainly arable crops. But we also make different machines for vegetables. And there's always this sort of, this can be evangelical at times where people say, I'm either no-till or I plow or I strip-till or I do this or I do that. And generally the higher value vegetable products, they're normally produced using higher tillage, higher energy intensity. And it's quite a focal point of Horizon is to try and focus on that fresh product market rather than the arable, which we're also very much in and working hard on, but we're working hard on the fresh produce. And between no-till and ploughing, we always know the result of ploughing. We've done it for 50, 70 years. We generally get an even crop stand and we have good nutrient availability. Obviously, no-till is very economic, and we can have all the benefits of protecting the soil and carbon and stuff. And so it's trying to find where's the position where farm profitability, repeatable profitability can be. Strip till, which is, I'm talking more about strip till here than no till today, has been something we've been practicing at home for even 5 or 6 years before we had the farm, but as a company, nearly 20 years. Strip till is the practice of only performing tillage on the seeding line. So if you are growing a crop 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 centimeters apart, you end up only working 30, 40% of the field rather than 100% of the field. And that can bring numerous benefits, such as energy efficiency, labor, time, reduced fertilizer due to more accurate placement, the ability to have inter-row mulch to control weeds, and possibly even the ability to grow nitrogen-fixing legumes between your cash crops to reduce your synthetic N. It's a very efficient practice, and it's something that's really growing quickly at the moment, especially in vegetable products across Europe. That's what we're seeing as a manufacturer, at least. And we're working hard on integrating more and more technology into it. The other good thing with strip till, this is our strip till row unit. So it's a leading disc. It clears residue, and then you can perform tillage down from 10 centimeters down to 30 centimeters, and you're only working in the seeding line. So the picture on the right is actually a dairy farm in Norfolk, and they have taken pasture straight from ryegrass through to a maize crop, and with very, very minimal soil disturbance. This slide shows a vegetable field in Tasmania. I'm showing some information on Tasmania because we've had really great success out there with winter veg production. They have a similar climate to us because they're off the south of Australia there. They get more rain, around 1,000 millimetres of rain. Similar soil types, similar climate. They don't get the heat and the droughts that the mainland does. And it's always been the belief that to establish vegetable and salad crops, you need fine tilth, get rid of all the residue, do deep tillage, and work in a bed system to aid with drainage and wheelings, etc. And we were approached about 10 years ago by this company to change that. And so here you can see the change. On the left is how they used to do it, and on the right, that is a vining pea field, which is coming into broccoli or cauliflower. It's a single pass with our machine, placing fertilizer in the strips, and the transplanter would be following behind. One of the most interesting things that we found in Tasmania has been with irrigation. So although they get 1,000 millimetres of rain, irrigation is quite expensive there, and they try to do as little of it as possible. So one of the main reasons they switched their entire 3,000+ hectares of winter veg to strip till was due to water utilisation. So on the left, you can see 2 passes of an irrigator at 25 to 30 mils, and on the right, they have half the water use for the same yield. And that is huge for them due to the cost of water in Australia. It's not free, and so that's been a significant economic benefit to them. So for this grower, the benefits of strip till, obviously you're only working on the seeding line. Between 55 and 75% of the field can remain under residue, and there's good retention of soil moisture, much easier harvesting conditions. The fact that you haven't moved the entire field means you carry the equipment much better, which means that he can establish the following crop also with minimal energy input. And with the crop performance, they've not seen a single yield drop. It's only been on par or increasing versus conventional. And that is mainly linked to more extreme climates. The field is more able to deal with that than on a conventionally sort of heavily tilled seed bed. They've had better root development and, of course, less irrigation. This slide is showing on the same day, 30 meters apart. It was a very hot day at 35 degrees with a 25 kilometer wind. And you can see that the plants on the conventionally tilled field are suffering, whereas on the other field where we have inter-row residue, the wind speed very close to the soil is significantly reduced. It creates sort of a turbulence effect in the wind and slows it down. We've seen that a lot across both Australia and southeastern Europe, where they try to keep the inter-row residue to slow the wind. Has a lot of relevance in the UK from sugar beet blow, and even with veg crops, it's still a risk here. So there's numerous benefits to that. Just speaking about UK, we've had quite a lot of success with Riviera Produce and Barfoot's in Sussex. 3 years, Riviera have moved nearly all of their cauliflower production over to strip till, and Barfoot's, we've done some tests with tender stem broccoli, French beans, and there's an ongoing project with them on sweet corn. And so a lot of these higher value crops, which you'd only ever consider to be on a plough, power harrow based system, we're finding solutions for them. It is a systems approach, so it's not just buy one of our machines and hey presto, here we go. It's a systems approach where they have to consider to look after the field better. They're going to do less tillage, they need to do less harvest damage, and so it's been an ongoing process and project, but the efficiencies that they've got in an industry which is extremely tight margins has helped them maintain profitability. I spoke briefly before about the natural supporting structure. and this field was taken in Lincolnshire, I believe, which would have been 2 years ago. It's a very tough harvest for everybody, and I'm not saying that even whatever tillage method you'd used, you wouldn't have got away with it in that year fully. But what we do have with strip till is this natural supporting column structure, and the inter-row, which has not been disturbed, maintains that natural supporting structure. So we can carry these huge 50+ ton machines that we like to put over the fields, and do less damage to the soil, which means we have to do less to establish the next crop. And that, to me, on our farm, is one of the biggest benefits I've seen of it versus a plough-based system. And we've also done some veg tests on my farm with strip till. So these are some collie, I think. And we've done different inter-row cover crops, catch crops, or living companions with veg to see how they react to it. And it's been quite interesting studying that. We've looked at different ways of controlling that, whether we glyphosate off before we plant, after, or we crimp after we plant, or even mow after we plant, to see how that affects nitrogen use and crop performance, etc. Here are some photos of some pumpkins. As you can see, it's a varied success, but we were trying to grow pumpkins into a living clover mulch so that they sit on the clover and have a much better skin finish, but also we didn't apply any nitrogen or fertilizer whatsoever. We've learned a lot about leguminous crops and when they decide to pass nitrogen to the cash crop, and it's certainly not an easy one. We also grow sugar beet, which is obviously in a very challenging time at the moment. We've had various successes and we've had various failures with sugar beet in strip till. On the whole, it works, especially if the planter, sugar beet drill technology is up with dealing with residues and less level seed beds, which a lot of them aren't. But we have had nearly 90 tons on strip till with 1/2 herbicides. So it can be a very, very profitable crop for us, especially if we keep the chem spend down and the nitrogen use down and the tillage down. It can still be quite a profitable crop. And in fact, in the picture where you can see the harvester, we direct drilled wheat after that. And so we did no tillage after the beet, and we had a 9-ish ton wheat crop after that. So it can be quite a profitable rotational system. And the natural supporting structure is keeping that harvester from making damages. Just finishing off on this, we're doing a lot with inter-row cover crops. So if you can see on the right of this page, where there's 2 red arrows, that's actually not where the cash crop will go. That's where a companion or a cover crop is going. So when we prepare the field with the strip till, we can offset the seeding coulter to drill cover crops 25 centimeters offset of the crop. And that means that we can deal with that cover crop in a very different way to what is being seen at the moment, because it's not in the way of our cash crop. So generally we're leaving that cover crop until we plant the following crop. So we're maintaining a lot of ground cover, which is really bringing carbon levels up because we're keeping the covers in the ground for a long time. I would say that other than the fact that it's helping the soil, we have nearly eliminated the need for herbicides in maize by doing this. So we kill off the inter-row cover, which could be done with glyphosate, or if it was at the right growth stage, by crimping. And then we very, very rarely would need a herbicide on the field after that. And that almost, I think, could be achieved with vegetables and sugar beet if it was managed correctly. So it's a really minimal approach, and the ag chem costs are really reduced by that. This is just showing inter-row clover as well, which we've actually got a permanent trial. It's now 4 years old, where the clover's never been killed, and the cash crop is always offset to the clover crop. So we've been trying and playing with that. And here you can see on the left we have a constant clover crop in a trial plot. On the right, you can see the maize looks really stressed, and that's because the clover has kind of won the fight. And on the right picture, the maize looks healthier. I have seen you have to stress the clover plant at exactly the right time for it to kind of back off and pass nutrients to your cash crop. If you get that timing wrong, then the opposite happens and the clover wants to grow and your cash crop suffers. So that's something that at Horizon we've been working on some different solutions for suppressing clover between cash crops, and what timing, and can we do that in the crop, and up to what growth stage, and at what timings would it work. And the idea of that is that if they begin heavily taxing synthetic nitrogen or restricting its use, then us as an equipment company, we have a feeling of where we could go with that. And the news that you hear from policymakers is that synthetic nitrogen will be more and more restricted going forward. On cover cropping, there's some other interesting things we found with the sensors, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation. We've had different trials of killing the cover crop at different stages to see how that affects soil moisture, particularly if we grow something like maize or a late planted, it would be relevant to a late planted vegetable crop or similar. If you kill the cover crop early, the idea is that it would reveal the soil to the sun, and therefore you would dry out more, etc., etc. But there's also the argument that the cover crop is using water in the field. And what we found was, in the map on the right, you can see on the left-hand side is red and the right-hand side is green. There's actually a higher soil moisture on the right than on the left. But on the left, the cover crop was killed early. On the right, the cover crop was killed after planting. So what we learned was that actually by keeping the cover crop there and shielding the surface of the soil from the sun is reducing evaporation, which is having a much greater effect than what the cover crop itself is using to stay alive in terms of water. So keeping a living crop until planting has proved that we have more moisture available. And this was a really relevant trial because it was in 2 or 3 years ago when we had that really dry spring. The crop did a lot better where the cover crop was than where it did where it was bare, because we were hunting for moisture. We're lucky because our machine tells us to change the depth if we don't have adequate moisture for germination, but it's still an interesting study. Finishing off where we're going with our farm, we're introducing an agroforestry system, which I know Rhizome or Lincoln also have one. It's a first field is being planted this year, if it ever stops raining. And we'll roll it out over 75 hectares between now and 2023. It's 28-meter rows. We are doing this for a commercial reason. The trees have a commercial return to us. A lot of people always say to me, well, you know, what about the shading, or how will it interact or whatever? But I actually see it that the trees will at least pay as much in the field as the arable lanes in between. So we're growing predominantly hazelnuts, some walnuts. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at different hybrids and varieties to suit the fens, which has its challenges. There's not a lot of people in the fens you can ask about hazelnuts, but it's more than doable. So we plan to mechanically harvest the nuts and be the first provider of nuts in the UK, and that as a heavy sort of black grassy, poorly drained Lincolnshire arable farm, which is returns are okay, but we want to create a third dimension of income on the farm and something we can directly retail. So that's why we're doing it. It will look a bit strange because it's not a monocrop of hazelnuts. We have nurse trees of alder and birch in between for nutrient passing. So particularly alder is a great N fixer and nurse tree to all nut trees. So I don't want to get my trees hooked on synthetic N. So we're going to try and manage that without. And we will cycle the nurse trees in amongst the cash crop trees in terms of cutting them down, replanting them, and using the biomass, hopefully, to provide energy to the farm. And we just hope that it gives a much better soil structure and biodiversity on the farm. And most importantly, people worry about the value of our land, but going forward between my life, I'm 35, through to 2050, 2060, I very much believe that a truly diverse income farm that we have will be worth significantly more than it is now as a monocrop arable farm today. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing it. So thank you very much. I hope you've understood some of that. And if you want to follow anything that we're doing, you can follow us on social media, which is on the screen at the moment. And I'd be more than happy to answer any questions there might be.
Okay, George, that was fantastic and inspirational, and it's absolutely wonderful to see how much you've achieved in a relatively short amount of time, and how it's co-created with your own agricultural background. It's just phenomenal. So, just I think on behalf of everybody, well done, mate.
Thank you.
Agriculture. I love the picture of the cabbage cutting tractor bogged into mud, because I'm down in Boston. I'm looking out my window with a gang of cabbage cutters in the field next to me. Doing drill, I can tell you now. So,
not fun.
It's a bit of a mess. So, yeah, really, genuinely well done. If there's any questions for anybody who's listening in, please put them in the chat. I see my son James has already put cheap in, so he's after a bit of help, everybody. So have a look at that if you can. But please put any questions in. I guess from Claire Rose, really one of the ones that struck me was the carbon credit piece that you mentioned early on in your talk. I thought that was fantastic. I've not heard of anyone yet who's commercialised that, so that was new news to me. Is that UK, or are you on stage of that and testing it? Do you see that mechanisms for other people to get involved?
Yeah, so it's not something that I am marketing or anything involved in more than just as a farmer. But it's a group of 11 Danish farmers which have come together to form an accreditation process for carbon. Long term, they aim to produce a true value and repeatable certification process across Europe. And they expect, speaking to policymakers, that 2027 to 2030, some of this will move more to sort of state regulation and state control, possibly. But what's the interesting thing of that is that if they put a value to soil carbon now, when those negotiations begin and those policies are written, there's a known value to the farmer. And if we didn't do anything with it, and we sort of go through and wait for the EU or UK government to decide what they're going to do with soil carbon, we might get a very bad deal. And we're quite used to those as farmers. So it's really good that these 10 or 11 big Danish farms have poured what is quite a lot of money into a accreditation process, which the thing that they've achieved really well is that they've got industry interest and industry approval for the sale of it. And that's been the hardest part. There's lots of dreaming about selling soil carbon, but it's getting industry to recognize it as a standard and a process, which is what they've achieved, which they've took 5 years of a lot of money and research to get that done. So
yeah, oh, well done. It's fantastic. We're talking to Indigo Ag as well, who are doing some in the US. Is it? I assume it's a similar sort of model.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so Indigo are a lot bigger, and I mean this company in Denmark will not be the only one. When big industry sees the value of soil carbon, it will fall into the hands of the mighty. But it's really interesting.
Yeah, Rob Ward's just follow-up question. So comment from Rob was, with carbon credits, how can the market be sure that the carbon stored isn't used in years to come? So the concern is if you sink it now and it expires off in, say, 10 years.
So with Commodity Carbon, the company we're talking to, you sign up for, it's really 10 years, but 5. It doesn't mean you can't leave or anything, but they're dealing with it over a 10-year period. It's so new that if you sign up for 10 years and you sequester 12,000 tons of carbon and you get paid for it, and then the contract ends and you decide to slash the trees and burn them and plow and power harrow and pour nitrogen on and everything else that you want to do. It is a bit unknown at the moment as to how the industry is going to handle that, because you're re-emitting what you've been paid to put in the soil. But that falls the same as digging oil out of the ground or mining coal, and it's very difficult in the modern world to say what's the process of this forever. Like, what happens if someone removes it in 2100 or 2200? And that is tricky, and there is no easy answer. But you can't do this process just on an annual rolling contract. I believe you can sign up for 5, but they're pushing now to be sort of 2021 to 2031 would be your period. And by 2031, I don't think you'll be allowed to do bad practice on soil. That unfortunately, I'm not lobbying for more red tape in farming at all, but the noises you hear is that there's going to be more and more tighter controls on what we can do. So you probably wouldn't be allowed to remove it quickly, because regulation would stop you. But that's the noises I hear anyway.
Yeah, I suspect you're right, and probably not 2030, maybe sooner. Yeah, that's fantastic. I just want to shout out to Tammy as well, Tammy Smalley from Links Wildlife Trust. Tammy's has got two very, very important projects going on in Lincolnshire, NELMS projects, so test pilots for the ELM scheme on things like farm biodiversity, ecosystem services, etc. I think she's keen to connect with you. So, or anybody who wants to hear about ELMS and NELMS and what Tammy's doing, please reach out to Tammy. Her email's on the link. What I'm going to do now is go over to Ian. That's all right, George, and there'll be more questions that come up, and we'll come back to you at the end if that's all right. So I'm going to hand over to Ian Gould, who I think most people know, and I think Ian's walked around most fields in Lincolnshire by now in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. So over to Ian, who can talk about soil resilience and quality. So thanks, Ian.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. And thanks as well, George, for that fantastic presentation earlier on the management side, which I'll be briefly touching on, but thankfully you've done a fantastic overview, or quite a detailed overview. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of looking at soils, kind of the mechanisms behind the stuff that George was talking about. So how we can improve soil quality and actually what's going on in the soil. Bit of soil science 101 maybe, but we're also looking at it in a global context, what challenges soils are facing at the moment. As Simon said, I'm Ian Gould. I'm soil scientist at the uni. My time spent between research on soils across Lincolnshire and a bit wider, and also doing basis delivery on some of the soils courses for basis. So I'll get my screen right. So let's start with, I'm very passionate about soils, so I guess we can start with the question, what are we actually asking of our soils? Because we rely on them so much, and I'm sure lots of you, or you'll all be aware of the importance of them, but let's look at the challenges that they're facing going forwards and how we can kind of address those questions. So what are we asking our soils to do, really? So recently, unfortunately, you'd have seen this week, we've had some quite intense or heavy rainfall across lots of England and Wales. This was the flood warning map from yesterday. It's evolved a bit today, and it was a bit more red, I think, in Lincolnshire the day before. But we're seeing increasingly more instances of flooding, and soils are taking a bit of a hammering there, but also soils have it in themselves to be able to start to help to mitigate some of the impacts of soils by improving their structure, improving that kind of drainage. So we're seeing increased rates of flooding, unfortunately, up and down the country, particularly in Lincolnshire. We've seen some quite devastating farm floods over the last few years. So we need soils that are going to be able to drain and be resilient to those flooding instances. And in the summer as well, if we get a heavy rainfall, that can cause quite a bit of erosion and break down a soil structure. So we need soils to drain well and get rid of that water. We also need soils that can hold the water. Lots of you will be aware of the growing movement, particularly in the east of England, Water Resources East. We're looking in the summer at less and less water resource. as there's increasing demand from agriculture, but also from urban use and industry. How can we hold more water in our soils in summer? So we've got two problems here. We've got too much water potentially in winter. We need to get it out of the system. We've got too little water in summer. We need to be able to hold water. So we're starting to build up quite a complex picture of what actually we're not demanding of our soils, we are asking of them. Locally, there are two really big problems that are predicted to get increasingly kind of at the top of the agenda. They're already quite high up the agenda. Globally as well, let's look at carbon. You can see over the past, since the Industrial Revolution, we know that there's been CO2 emissions have rocketed up, and the links to climate change. And that's a massive channel problem. And what I'm going to talk about this morning is actually soils do play a part in the carbon cycle, and can be really, if managed well, can probably sequester more carbon taken out of the atmospheric pool. And not to forget, what else do we want from our soils? Well, we have a growing population, we're all aware, and we need to produce food from. We need to produce good quality food from our soils without compromising all the other fantastic functions they do for us. There's hundreds of other functions that soils do. I haven't got time to talk about them all. Biodiversity, habitat is one, nutrient cycling. I can talk for hours about them. What we're going to do focus on today is actually, last couple of years, I've mainly focused on the water side of things. So I have a research project. We're going to focus on carbon today and its role in soils. So let's go back, take back a step, look at the global carbon cycle. When we talk about carbon, everyone's very, very interested in and focusing on carbon in the atmosphere. That's the problem, really. CO2 pumped into the atmosphere over the last 150, 200 years. So we've got atmospheric carbon, and that's been increasing, and that's causing us problems with feedbacks to the Earth system. Atmospheric carbon, 770 gigatons, roughly. Gigatons is 1 billion tons. So it's 1 billion, 1979 Volkswagen Beetles is the equivalent in your heads. So atmospheric carbon, 770 gigatons of atmospheric carbon. That's huge, right? What other carbon pools have we got? We've got carbon in vegetation. That's quite a big pool as well, 600 gigatons of carbon just in vegetation. That's what's getting fixed from the atmosphere. So we have two very big carbon pools. However, an even a more massive carbon pool is soils. Soils hold more carbon than the vegetation and the atmosphere put together. And I think that's a fantastic sort of awakening that really kind of got me into soils. One of the aspects that got me into soils is the fact that carbon in soils can be a huge sink for carbon, but they can also be a huge emitter for carbon. So how we manage that soil carbon could play a role in this cycle and help potentially to get more of that atmospheric carbon out of the system. It's not the one fix, it's not the single answer to curing the problem, but it is a component of a management strategy we can do as a society. So soil carbon. How can we, is what we're really going to focus on this talk, but how can we do that? How can we build soils to be more resilient to face those climate change issues, but also store more carbon? And I think key to that, I would say, are 3 key factors in soils. We want good soil structure, we want lots of organic matter, or as much as we can get, and we want a functioning biodiverse community. I'm not so much of a soil biologist, so I'm going to focus this talk on these 2 topics at the moment: structure and organic matter. You can see a lovely structured soil there in an image from the EA Think Soils document. So organic matter, lots of you might be aware of it. What is it? We'll talk about what it is on the next slide. However, it gives us some fantastic benefits to soil. So it's not just a store of carbon. It darkens the soil, which a darker soil can warm quicker, gives a bit of an earlier window. Builds soil aggregates. It can retain water, so we can hold water in it, but also we can get water infiltration. So getting more organic matter in the soil might help us start to look at how we can address some of these water challenges we have. It can hold nutrients, but it can also be nutrients can also be released from it. And generally, if you get more organic matter in the soil, you can get a more workable soil. So how do we build organic matter? What is organic matter really? Well, let's have a look at a soil profile. We've got atmospheric carbon in the atmosphere, and that's the carbon we kind of want to get out of the atmosphere if we can. So obviously we know that carbon by photosynthesis is fixed by plants and ends up in the plant structures. That's how we grow crops, that's how we grow plants. So the carbon ends up in the plant. But what we're really interested in here, well, I'm interested in as a soil scientist, is how that carbon can then get into the soil, but get locked into the soil. And I guess there's a few pathways. The first step happens is when the plant dies or it's returned to the surface of the soil, and it starts to break down. And that's what we call active soil organic matter, SOM, or active carbon. It's the first stage of the process. Plant matter, which looks is the sort of green stuff that you'll recognize, gets broken down, and that's quite a more rapid process, but a lot of it gets released as CO2 as we burn down the carbon, as the microorganisms decompose it. We get a lot of release of CO2 in that first step, let's say. And it might take weeks, it might take months, but slowly, a lot of that, once that carbon, the active carbon's broken down, what's left over, I wouldn't say it's the dregs, but it's either the stuff that the microbial communities can't degrade anymore. It might be very lignin focused, or it's kind of occluded. The microorganisms can't get to it anymore. It's stuck in clay molecules, it's waterlogged or whatever. So we have sort of active carbon, which is quite transient. It's moving around a lot of time. But if we can get it to the stable carbon fraction, that's when it's going to stay around in soils for a much longer time. Could be years, decades, hundreds of years, depending on our management of the soils. So you get much more CO2 released from the active carbon. You get much less CO2 with those red arrows from the stable carbon. If you can't, sometimes it's hard to get your head around that when you're just talking about stuff in soils. So if you look at it in terms of a walk around the woods, this is us at the Rhizome campus the other day, and the grounds team have been moving, over autumn, we're moving leaf litter up. So there are mounds of leaf litter in a pocket of the Rhizome campus that show the different stages of decomposition. So you could almost think of, as we have the plant matter, as it's piled up, those sort of fresh leaves, fresh autumnal leaves, that's starting to break down. That's our active carbon. A lot of the carbon in those leaves will be lost to CO2, but once it's broken down more and more and more, we get, after 2 years, which is this pile, a more stable carbon. The carbon's not breaking down as rapidly. What's left might be a bit more lignin focused. It might be more sort of staying in soils for a lot longer. And that's how you can kind of see it in sort of, without focusing on the soil, how you can kind of picture it, I guess. If we can get more of that stable carbon in our soils, we can start to build a bit more organic matter more sustainably and going forwards. So organic matter, I talk about soil organic matter, but roughly 60% of organic matter is carbon, 58% if you will. So if anybody wants to do any sort of carbon calculations on organic matter, there's lots of different ways to look at it, but you could do it for rough figures. You could look at it as 58% carbon. So if you've got a ton of organic matter, that's 580, a metric ton, 580 kilograms of carbon. But that's just carbon, that's not carbon dioxide equivalent. Actually, if you link it to CO2 equivalent, it's actually a bit more. So 1 ton of organic matter is about 2.1 tons of CO2 equivalent. So if you can get 1 ton of organic matter stored in a body of soil, take quite a lot of soil actually. If normal soils are between 2 and 5% organic matter, that's a lot of soil to store in. But 1 ton can store about 2.1 tons of CO2 equivalent. Doing the maths, I think that's just a bit under a return flight to Las Vegas for the equivalences. So that's the theory. We can talk about that from the textbooks and think that's all great and it's perfect. We're going to just store more carbon in our soils. In practice, it's a bit more challenging because not all soils are the same. So we're going to focus on 3 areas really now about how we can build more carbon in our soils and why they differ. We've got soil type, soil structure, and time. Management, I'm not going to focus on because George has done a fantastic presentation on soil management and how we can start to move towards that later. He did earlier. So number 1, why is soil type important? Why is where we are in Lincolnshire or further afield important for how much carbon we can store in our soils? Well, actually, sandy soils can't hold as much carbon as clay soils. And why is that? It's because if we scale up, if we do a microscopic view of the soil, clay soils are much more complex environments. So if you think about where organic matter could be stored in that soil, it could be occluded between different minerals and organisms can't get to it. So you kind of get a lot more breakdown of organic matter, large aerated spaces, which the microorganisms get their oxygen from in sandy soils. Whereas in clay soils, there's a lot more barriers for those microorganisms to get to the organic matter. So clays can store more organic matter. They can also be a bit wetter, which slows that breakdown, particularly the aerobic breakdown of carbon. Why might that be important to Lincolnshire? I've spent the last 3-4 years digging holes in most of those colours on that map. Most of you must be familiar with the soils here. Clays, well, where might hold a bit more carbon? Well, the clays, generally the green, a bit of the blue on the maps as well. I've only highlighted some areas. The clays tend to have a bit more organic matter to start with. Then we've got sands, which tend to be the red patches on the map. They might struggle to hold as much as a clay soil. And we're also going to note that we do have soils that are incredibly high in organic matter, and actually it's not a case of sequestering, it's a case of preventing loss of organic matter, like our organic soils as well, particularly down in the fens and almost up the Wiv and almost up to Lincoln. So that's soil texture. What about soil structure? Well, I'm a big fan of aggregate stability. It's what I did my PhD in. And aggregates are a really good proxy to indicate if you've got good soil structure, but also if you've got good organic matter. They link very well to water retention. If you've got good aggregates, you can hold water in the aggregate, but around the outsides of the aggregate, water can drain. So we can hold water in the middle of it, drain water on the outside. That might link to our water challenges we mentioned at the start of the talk. What is a good aggregate? What's a bad aggregate? Well, this is a trial I would have done if we were face-to-face in a pot in front of us. However, we're a bit limited to that now. So here's a Petri dish. Top aggregate has very high organic matter. The bottom aggregate doesn't have very high organic matter. And if we drop them in a Petri dish of water, we can see that bottom aggregate is broken down. It's not very stable. There's not much gluing it together because it's not got much organic material in it binding it together. If we break down soil structure, that exposes the carbon a bit more to oxidation as well. So if we can improve the aggregates, we can also improve our carbon sequestering ability. But it's a bit of a chicken and egg, because more organic matter improves aggregation, more aggregation improves organic matter. And the third aspect is time. So can we sequester carbon up and up and up forever? Well, no, every soil has what we'd call a carrying capacity. So let's have a look at our soil carbon in the soils. We currently, if we're running around, say, 2%, 3% organic matter in current practice, if we start to adopt new practice, perhaps some of the stuff George was highlighting, slowly our carbon's going to build, but it is going to take years as we adopt a new practice, and eventually it will plateau off at a set level as well. And obviously in clays and sands, this is going to be a very different curve. Interestingly, what George talked about was he went from his fields had grass historically had grass, went to arable. It's actually this line backwards. If you think they had a grassland equilibrium, then they dropped, and they're probably still dropping, or they might be plateauing. We'll have to ask George about that. And it could go either way after the end of it. Here we've got a fantastic gradient of soils and how that improvement of carbon really can be shown. So we have the gradient of management here. So we have arable, grassland and woodland, and you can just see over time, if you've got a different system, you can see the soils get darker and the structure improves slightly. When we're talking about agriculture, we're not looking at the woodland side of stuff. We're probably looking at somewhere between these first two soils is kind of where we want to be going. So that's what we're interested in. That's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of soil carbon and how we can improve it. Quick last focus on what we're doing at the university. Number of projects at the moment, really exciting. They're all kind of just starting, getting set up. We're going to have doing a lot more sampling around different land use changes across Lincolnshire. So we're looking at different soil carbon fractions, going back to the active or stable method, and looking at different management practices in a project with our life sciences colleagues starting very soon. Also, we're looking at fluxes, and the problem with carbon is it's difficult to measure how much we can sequester, but we could measure how much is coming off of a crop and how much is coming off the soil. But that generates a lot of data. So what we're using with our robotics colleagues in Lincoln Agri-Robotics is sequestering as much, or compiling as much data from carbon emissions as possible with flux towers, with sensors, seeing how that might change as we change practice going forward. Also, some of you, as George mentioned, we have an agroforestry site. Isabel Wright, my colleague, you can see her in the image there, is leading on this. We've had this for 3 years now, or coming up to 3 years. It's a great way of us looking at long-term change in soils and practice and how we can build carbon. If anybody's more interested in that, get in touch with us, get in touch with Isabel, and and we can chat more about that. And finally, what's really important for soils is everybody learns a bit more about soils. I can talk for hours about them, but I'm going to stop talking in 30 seconds. So we are running lots of soils courses at the university. We've got basis courses. So if you're interested in soil management, we have soil and water management, which we're actually running today. So after this call, I'm going to join that session. If you're interested in soil health and biology, we run with our life science colleagues quality of soils. And also we're doing a lot more. There's basis foundation award in soils. So if you just kind of want to get a bit more, perhaps you're in sort of an affiliated industry to agriculture, or you've got a company that wants to have a bit of a crash course in soils, we can run foundation awards in soils, which is pretty much an overview in a week of over 5 days of what soil science is really. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what we're looking at and what we're up to. I hope you've enjoyed that. I'll say thank you very much. And yes, I'll see if there's any questions.
Ian, that was fantastic, and really complimented George's talk beautifully. So thanks for that, mate. My $64,000 question. So I love the bit about stable carbon and unstable carbon. I get that completely. Am I right in assuming that what George is doing with min-till and strip-till practices, i.e. not ploughing and rotivating, is encouraging that transfer from stable to unstable to stable carbon? So is the process of min-till a very positive process to promote stable carbon? I don't know. That's my question. But then I guess if that is the case, that's good news from George in terms of carbon credits, because you're actually having increased confidence that the carbon that you're actually sequestering is stable. So is that proven?
Well, I guess there's two factors playing in there. So even unstable carbon is in the soil is good because it would have come from the CO2 pool in the atmosphere. So even if it's unstable, a proportion of it will get to that stable fraction. However, if you can improve soil structure and if you can get more roots in the soil and kind of create more complex environments in the soil, you'll occlude more of that stable fraction. So you'll build on the stable fraction more, probably get more of the active to the stable. Anything that's improving soil structure is going to kind of build better aggregation and better protection of some of that more stable carbon. So yeah, so it's I mean, it's almost like the more carbon the more plant material you can get in, even if it's in the active fraction, some of it will still get down to that stable fraction. So
okay, yeah. So it's a game of numbers as well then. So the bigger the amount of carbon in the soil, the more of it's going to be stable as well. So,
yeah.
And on that comment as well. It's just an interesting point.
I was also, Ian, one thing that I'm really interested in is how the trees will affect our drainage on the farm. Because we have a silt, it runs together really, really easily and forms an impermeable barrier. But yet wherever we have vegetation and that impermeability can't build in the top 2 inches due to an extreme weather event, we don't have pooling water. But where we have anything bare, we have pooling water. And the one thing with carbon that and I just still don't understand is with the optics we can pretty much at the moment 50 mil, but soon 150 mil we can scan. But when you integrate agroforestry as well, it's the different depth profiles you're working on and how the interaction between trees and arable crops and perennial roots, and there's lots of things like, should we trim the roots at the edge of our arable crops or should we leave them? And there's and might they produce more structure into our crop alleys than if we were to trim them back and keep them within their road to stop them interfering with the crops? And it's the infiltration thing is one of the most interesting parts of putting trees in the field for me, because to redrain a farm is £1,000 an acre, whereas I'm being paid to put trees in the field. So if the trees can help with drainage, they might hinder it, but it's interesting. The aggregation, infiltration, carbon, and the interaction of perennial roots to a clay silt soil is something that's, I think, needs a lot of study to see the benefits.
Okay, yeah, really smart. Yeah, I'm going to just get the questions coming in from Gareth to Ian, Gareth Fuchs. Ian, I'll read it direct. You said you would not cover biology, but how important do you think the inverted commas liquid carbon pathway and sugars passing from flora to fauna is in active soil organic matter?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. So the liquid carbon pathway, the exudates that come from the biological organisms in the soil, roots and microorganisms, is usually it's quite an easily decomposed, like kind of sugary, sweet type of sweet. I wouldn't use the term sweet, but not very complex type of carbon, so it can break down quite easily. However, in breaking down, you are feeding a food web, and you're also feeding a kind of structural improvement in the soil that in turn is going to help build that carbon. So it's quite a rapid way of getting carbon in. It might not be the most stable, but it kind of sparks a bit of a chain reaction that could hold more carbon indirectly by building structure and by improving more biological conditions in the soil.
Okay, brilliant. All right, thanks, Ian. That's brilliant. And then one for George from Anna Jackson, and I think Anna encapsulates the $64,000 question about agroforestry. So it says, George, are you worried about lack of photosynthesis in your cash crops due to agroforestry? So that's light interception by the tree component affecting the ground component.
Yeah. I'll tell you the amount of nights I've lied asleep thinking about this, but if we've aligned north-south, so, or not quite north-south, it's north-north, south-south-west, if you like. So the sun passing over, it's down the crop alley, so we aren't going to get too much shading. Secondly, where we've put hazelnuts, we've chosen varieties that are basically quite stumped, so quite short, quite productive little trees. So they're only as tall as me, maximum sort of 6 foot, for example, would be about as big as some of the varieties we've chosen. The nurse trees will get taller. And then we've staggered walnut with hazelnuts only every 48 or wider than that, 52 meters, I think it is. So that when they get older, which I will be old then, that's 20 years, 30 years away, they will impact the cash crop. But if you look at the nutritional value of the nuts and the demand for healthy, nutritious, perennial, low-carbon food, I'm not really worried about losing a bit of annual crop income for the benefit of what that perennial plant will give. And secondly, in a hot summer, I've seen at Stephen Briggs's farm on Twitter and stuff, that it's actually helped the crop because it's kept the hot air away, it's shaded them, it's stopped photorespiration, which is when a C3 plant gives off water rather than maintains it because it's gone over its sort of temperature threshold. So there's loads of things to think about with temperature extremes and how an annual crop deals with extremes or shortage of water or shortage of light it's really complex to know how that will all affect, but we've done everything we can to limit it, basically.
Yeah, and I think the theory, my understanding of the theory, and Isabel Wright will tell me this, I'm sure, but so the theory is if you've got two crops, the thing about agroforestry is you're intercepting light over a longer part of the season. So if you've got a wheat crop, then it's browning off in June, end of July, so it's stopping photosynthesis. But over the top of that, you've got a nut crop which carries on photosynthesizing through to September, October. So your net light interception is greater in an agroforestry system, but it might be partitioned in a way that you don't quite understand. So you might have less going into the wheat, more going into the nuts, and what you're hoping is the net balance is positive. So and I think that's my understanding of the theory of agroforestry. So I think it seems to work in my mind anyway. So,
yeah, and all we do as farmers is we take nuclear energy and we deliver something to somebody. So the more energy we can turn to a product is the better in theory. So yeah, exactly that, and it's a 3-dimensional capture of rather than more of a 2-dimensional capture of sunlight. So
yeah, brilliant. All right, I've got one from Paul Barnes with George. The question is, have you worked with any organic units on strip tillage methods?
Yes, definitely. About 10 years ago, we started in France with some organic farms, and there's a growing interest in it from organics, not only from our customers, but also from us as a manufacturer. And so our new unit has some features on it which are more suited to organic than conventional. But I think strip till for vegetable production in organics, and I'm sorry, I keep saying vegetables. There's totally, cereals is a known thing. It's totally possible. Vegetables been a tricky one. But yes, it's equally comfortable in an organic or non-organic system, mainly because we've now got the ability to look at controlling weeds in the interrow or controlling living companions in the interrow, which means obviously organics is becoming a market for us.
Yeah, it figures, doesn't it? It just sort of fits. It just feels like a natural fit. And I'm going to just I'm going to come back now. Question from Claire Rowe, really, for Ian, and question from Claire was if natural development cycles can be boosted through utilisation of technology or process. So how do you see that happening? And I guess that's a core question in as practitioners. So what more can practitioners do, farmers do, to try and accelerate the move towards particularly that stable carbon pool you mentioned, Ian? Maybe there's top two ideas.
Yeah, I get. Well, top two would be if you look at it, I see it as just a sort of mass balance. So you minimize losses, you increase inputs, right? So increasing, it's just it all depends on where you are, because some farmers, depending on what soil type you're on, what you might have access to. So some might be able to get a more of a manure input depending on where they're growing, if there's lots of livestock in the area. Others might not have access to that, particularly if you go further south where you've got really sandy soils in Suffolk, Essex, where they don't really have as much grazing and they really need to build their organic matters. But also less disturbance of the soil. That stable carbon is pretty stable, but if we disturb the system, it's going to release more, it's going to oxidate more, you might disrupt the structure. So less disturbance and finding inputs from somewhere, whether that's returning crop residue or some sort of organic input to the soil, manures, composts, returning residues.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Ian. That's fantastic. Well, we've come to the end of the questions in the chat, and I'm going to draw it to a close now, if that's all right. I really do want to thank everybody for turning out and listening to our talks this morning. So thank you for turning up. Sorry we can't do our usual sausage roll or bacon sandwich, but I really do hope that back in the autumn we'll be back to our normal operating procedure. So thanks for turning out. Thanks for turning out the audience, but real special thanks to Ian and George, two brilliant talks. It's just wonderful to see that's happening in Lincolnshire, and the innovation and the research behind it. So and good luck to your endeavours, George. It really is well needed. So that's it. I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, everybody. I don't know what the next session is, but no doubt Heather will be in touch with everybody. And thanks all. Have a great rest of the morning and touch base soon. Thank you. All right. Bye.